Our next research presentation today is very appropriate given the new CBA and continued discussion around competitive balance in baseball. Scott Brave is here to talk about a possible way to build it better. Scott.
Thank you, Scott. Let's see if I can get my screen shared here. Go to presentation mode. All right. Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you to SABR, Major League Baseball, Rawlings, and all the wonderful sponsors of this year's conference. It's really an honor to be able to come back here. I spoke 2 years ago when we had to go virtual during the early days of the pandemic. And so it's kind of nice to hopefully be here maybe at the end days of the pandemic, or at least as we transition to a little bit more normal situation. What I'm going to present today is going to be a little different than what most of the presentations you've seen this weekend. And for that, Andrew, Kevin, and I, this is joint work between the three of us, are very grateful. It's really been exciting to see the great analytical work at this conference on performance, game strategy, and rules. And now I get to discuss with you a little bit of the economics of the game and what until the last week was clearly the elephant in the room for the 2022 season, which is the new CBA. So here's the game plan for today. I plan to go pretty light on the details and heavy on the intuition, but hopefully there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions on both. I'm going to start by providing a little background on the economics of Major League Baseball and some of the big shifts that have taken place in the last decade or so. I'm then going to relate those changes to competitive balance. But first, we have to define actually what competitive balance means and how to measure it, because that's something that's always a little bit controversial. Then I'll go through some of the analysis at the team level to see how the changing economics of the game has filtered down to team balance sheets and rosters, importantly, and finally wrap up with a discussion of how the new CBA fits into this framework. So let's move on to the background. So the last decade has seen pretty immense growth in non-gate revenues and franchise values for Major League Baseball. You don't have to go look far for examples of this. I know just a few weeks ago, Forbes announced Major League Baseball had a new streaming deals with Apple and NBC Sports. We had the sale of MLB Advanced Media a few years ago. But player payrolls historically have been more closely aligned with gate revenues. And there's an easy way to see this. So this plot here shows you estimates of MLB finances from Forbes and other publicly available sources through 2018. So we wanted to stop before the pandemic. Some of that's availability, and also because we want to kind of leave the pandemic aside. A lot of these trends that we're talking about are pre-pandemic trends. And you can see in this figure, the total franchise value in Major League Baseball pretty much skyrocketed in the last decade. It was really only matched by the growth in non-gate revenues over this period. These two have been tightly linked. Whereas growth in both gate revenue and team payrolls, it was considerably less. And that link is quite clear in this graph. You can also see this when you look at it a different way, which is to look at sort of the average team in baseball. So in this case, we're tracking the average Major League team and benchmarking their non-gate revenue and their player payrolls to what they were in 2009. So these are in logs. So you can kind of think of over time, the differences kind of embodying growth in these two measures. So on average, non-gate revenues increased by about 50% from 2009 to 2018. Whereas on average, player payrolls increased by about 20% over the same period. So you can see there's a big difference here. And it really shouldn't be surprising. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to surmise that, this change in the underlying economics of baseball was reflected in the labor conflict that we just witnessed. Because as economists, we tend to think of as non-gate revenues as being historically less sensitive to player performance and wins and losses. You can kind of think of what's going on as really reflecting a shift in collective bargaining power from the players to the owners over this period. And consequently, what we've seen is actually the players' share of overall revenues has fallen as a result. You can see that quite clearly in this graph here, which looks at estimates again from Forbes and other public sources. The blue line here at the top shows you the share of non-gate revenue of total Major League revenues over this period. You can see that's been going up. The red line then shows you the player's share of these revenues, so salaries as a function of total revenues. And you can see over the same period that non-gate revenues became an even larger share of overall revenues in Major League Baseball. The player's share of total revenues reflected in salaries decline. What's even more striking is if you look at the magnitude of these changes, they're very, very similar. This suggests a very clear story of what might be going on. We're going to argue in this paper that these issues are actually very closely tied to recent concerns with competitive balance in Major League Baseball. And finally, when I get to the end, we're also going to argue that a lot of the things that were done in the new CBA go towards addressing these sorts of concerns. But before we can do that, we have to have a model, right? I have to give you some sense in which competitive balance is related to these economic considerations. So, and we are going to argue that they are very closely tied. So let's think about competitive balance and what that means. And when people talk about competitive balance, they tend to talk about it in two different ways. They talk about it in what I'm going to call a static sense and a dynamic sense. Let's start with the static, because I think it's the more traditional of the two. If we think of every Major League Baseball game as sort of being a coin flip because each team exerts a similar amount of effort trying to win, then we have sort of an ideal, perfectly statically competitive balanced league. This is a league where everyone's winning percentage is essentially 500. Deviations from this ideal then reflect what is commonly called parity, or if you want to think about it in the negative, disparity. And we can measure that by looking at the standard deviation of winning percentages across teams within a season. So the more dispersed those winning percentages are, the less they are from that ideal of a perfectly statically parity league. But clearly this form of competitive balance, it's not ideal. It does not encourage the sort of risk-taking behavior by teams that we view as beneficial to rewarding innovation. And we want to see the game move forward over time. If everyone was 500 all the time, there would be little incentive to do that. If you want to think of an example here, think of what would happen if patents weren't allowed for drug manufacturing. Awarding a patent incentivizes innovation by allowing the awardee to a patent to receive a competitive advantage over a period of time, right? And so achieving complete static parity at all times is not in the best interest of the game. Instead, we want to be able to see teams make progress over time. We want to see teams move up and down in the standings. We want to see them be able to make innovations and be rewarded for those innovations. So this is commonly thought of in terms of competitive balance as something like mobility, or again, in the negative, if you want to think about this as immobility. So this is really measuring the degree to which team winning percentages from season to season are sticky, right? This is sort of like a pooled first order autocorrelation in team winning percentages across seasons. And this correlation describes how often teams at the bottom or top of the standings flip roles from year to year, really capturing the dynamics of competitive balance. So we want to think in this paper of these two things jointly. We want to think about disparity, and we want to think about immobility. And we want to tie these all together with the economics of the game. And so the way we're going to do that is, in order to summarize all these things down, we're going to write down a very stylized panel time series model. Anyone who's worked with these models at all, you can see this equation here for team winning percentages. I is team, T is season. This is going to look pretty familiar to you. What this is it's an autoregressive moving average model with one lag, one autoregressive lag, one moving average term. And we're going to use this very simple framework to help guide how we might want to think about how these two measures, competitive balance measures, are jointly determined and what drives them. And we really think that that's something that's sort of been missing in the discussion of competitive balance, that there is this sort of connection between the static and the dynamic elements, and really think hard about what can change them, and hopefully both in a good way. So many of the levers that this model is going to have, which really, when I say levers, that's the institutions of the game. That's the rules, it's the basic structure of the game, it's what's collectively bargained. Many of these models' levers that could change either measure of competitive balance are going to resemble a trade-off. In other words, for Major League Baseball to achieve greater mobility, it's also often going to come at the cost of less parity. So there's often going to be this trade-off between the static and the dynamic elements of competitive balance, and we're going to show you how that works. These levers are going to be reflected in one of the model parameters. It's the Greek letter here is phi. It's that autoregressive term. And as an example of this, you can imagine something like the draft order in baseball, which is reverse ordered, right? It's sequenced from the worst performing to the best performing teams in the prior season. That's an example of something that might lead to something that would be reflected in winning percentages by phi, right? In particular, likely by a phi that's negative. It's something the league would like to promote, winning percentages not being sticky from time period to time period. Now, importantly, though, there are going to be other levers that do not face this trade-off, and these are the ones that we're going to focus on in this paper, because these are the ones that are likely to actually shift this trade-off relationship, shift the curve is the way we're going to refer to it, that ties these two measures of competitive balance together. And these levers are going to be captured in the moving average term of the model, the theta here, the Greek letter. And they're going to capture how within the structure of the game, teams are able to innovate and develop strategies that permit them to take advantage of above expectation performance and have that persist into subsequent seasons. So let's think a little bit about how this would work within this framework, because where theta shows up here, theta is actually multiplying the unobserved or the error component of this model. It's the unexplained portion of team winning percentages from season to season. We are going to interpret it as reflecting the deviations of a team's performance from what their collective set of player salaries would predict prior to the season. So teams are assembled prior to the season, players are paid, there's some expectation about how they would perform. They might perform above expectations, they might perform below expectations. Theta is going to measure how persistent that process is. If we get lucky and we have a lot of young players hit very early, we're paying them very little, but they're performing a lot for the team. Theta is going to measure how much of that carries over to the next season. So if you think about that as such, it's likely that this theta is going to be the key parameter that is actually being negotiated between players and owners in collective bargaining, because each of them would like to see the long-term impact of these surprises move in opposite directions. Unlike the phi parameter, where pretty much everyone would like to agree that we don't want everyone to have the same winning percentage from year to year. We want some variation in that. Theta, the players are going to prefer, actually, because this is tied to salaries, they want a lower theta, whereas owners are going to want a higher theta. So we're going to think really hard about theta and how that factors into collective bargaining. Now, the nice thing about this framework is the entire model actually can be summarized graphically, and we can solve for our definitions of immobility and disparity in terms of these two parameters, phi and theta. And in this figure here that I plotted here, showing immobility against disparity, you can see the trade-off that's coming in here through this curve. As the phi changes, what's happening is we're moving along this curve in the figure. So we're basically shifting between degrees of static and dynamic competitive balance. So these levers are basically just changing the trade-off, moving it in one direction or the other. However, as the theta changes, these levers are actually a way in that MLB can shift the curve out or in. And as MLB tries to achieve a lower or higher degree of both of these measures of competitive balance, theta is a very important driver. And in this case, the way I've written it here, we'd want the curve to shift in. So we'd want a lower value of theta. So it is actually pointing towards sort of the player's direction of what they want in this case. But this begs the question then as to what leads to shifts in theta. What is shifting theta? What are these policies? In economics, anytime that the wage or the labor wage differs from what the marginal value of labor is, we refer to that difference as a labor wedge. And theta is really the source of the labor wedge in this model. It's reflecting the owner's ability to secure player talent at wages below the player's marginal contribution to team wins. And if you think about this a little bit, this really reflects the current environment, which highly incentivizes teams to do just that by prioritizing young cost control players. You want young cost control players to maybe making big contributions to the team. But this raises an important question. I've written down a model. How do we even know that changes in the labor wedge impact competitive balance? This is a model. It could be wrong. Well, history shows us actually that it does, this is actually where we started this project. We thought this was a good jumping off point. And if you look at our two measures of immobility and disparity over a very long period of time, what you'll see is that the introduction of collective bargaining in baseball itself is an example of how this works. It is a theta type policy. The resulting end of the reserve clause and the rise of the free agency era led to a great reshuffling of talent across Major League Baseball, and both parity and mobility increased as a result, or as the figure shows, both disparity and immobility decreased in ways that persist to this day. So this was a very transformational event in the history of baseball, and it, in terms of competitive balance, at least, it was a very positive one. Now, what's happened here in recent years is something has changed a little bit after the last few CBAs. We actually saw an extended period where both disparity and immobility rose. Now, some of that was clearly the pandemic season. The pandemic season is a bit of an outlier, but the trend began before the pandemic, and it even showed up to a degree in the 2021 season. So going into these latest negotiations, it was still the case that we were seeing a little bit of an erosion in overall competitive balance. So to come full circle here, this begs the question, well, what changed? Well, we think what changed is the explosion of non-gate revenue and how it's changed the way teams respond and structure their payrolls. So here it actually helps to take a closer look at the team level. So the rest of what I'm going to show you today is team level insights. In the last 10 years, we find that on the basis of 2009 rankings for franchise value, we split teams into high franchise value, medium franchise value, and low franchise value, which really are largely large market teams, middle market teams, and small market teams. That lines up very well on those dimensions as well. What we found is that basically over the last decade, high franchise value teams, so large market teams, have seen their non-gate revenues increase far more than others on average, but with hardly any corresponding expansion of payrolls. So they've had this explosion in new revenue, but that's not translated into large increases in payrolls. What you actually see is the smaller and the mid-market teams, they see less of this non-gate revenue increase, but they have bigger increases in payrolls. So it seems to suggest that high franchise value teams have been able to extract more of the value from cost controlled players, which fits very well into this narrative of what Theta is doing and how these sort of competitive concerns factor into both collective bargaining and competitive balance. So let me show you some evidence here. So this is a similar graph to what I showed you on average for an average team, where here we've just split up the teams into the high, middle, and low franchise value categories. And this is the evidence that supports the contention that non-revenue growth seems to have benefited the high franchise value or the large market teams a little more than others. Right? It's very statistically significant differences here. Increases of greater than 50% since 2009, whereas the other two categories are below that, and those differences are statistically significant. Now, when you do the same thing in terms of payrolls, the picture's a little less clear, at least statistically speaking. We can't statistically say that these payroll differences are statistically significant from zero. I can't say that. Economically speaking, though, it's clear that there is a difference here between what's going on with the small and middle market teams and the large market teams. Payrolls for large market teams over the same period where non-gate revenues exploded, they barely budged in total. So this leads us to the new CBA, which we actually happen to believe was a step in the right direction on many of the fronts that we just talked about. If you look at some of the very early reporting on the details, and I apologize if any of these details have shifted because this came about very, very late in the course of putting together this presentation. It was almost a completely different presentation before this, but the details that I was able to find, if you look at some of these details, it does seem like this tentative agreement aligns with possible shifts in Theta in a way which should promote better competitive balance in baseball. So here we've grouped them into two types of policies that facilitate salaries that are more commensurate with production. There was a lot done in this area. The competitive balance tax thresholds were increased, so that somewhat binding soft salary cap has been, the pressure there has been alleviated a little bit. It's going to go up incrementally over the 5 years, but it is going up. Minimum salaries were also increased as well for those young cost control players that are tending to make big contributions to team wins. Bonuses for players that have yet to reach salary arbitration. A bonus pool was established. Another way to compensate these players that are disproportionately affecting wins and not yet at the point in their career where they can capture that value in their wages. Talk about implementing a draft lottery system, which clearly some degrees is a reinforcement of the other 5 parameter, but you can also think of as a Theta policy in some ways, and limits to and disincentives to service time manipulation. All of these things, you can see most of these things are acting on that lower dimension where lower paid players, younger cost control players. And there were even some efforts made to make non-gate revenues more tied to wins. So discussion about expanding the number of playoff eligible postseason teams, which would clearly enlarge the pie there, that number of teams that would be eligible for those revenues. Even what I found really interesting, discussion about player uniforms featuring advertising, which I think is a creative way to tie non-gate revenues more to wins, which is something that I think is very difficult in baseball. So all that being said, I think what we took away from the new CBA is it's certainly a step in the right direction. It's an incremental step in comparison maybe to the size of some of these shifts that we've seen in the game over the last 10 years. These issues are not likely going away, and they will continue to be front and center probably in future collective bargaining negotiations. I have no doubt about that. But keeping that in mind, we do feel that there are still elements of what our model suggests that really have yet to be addressed. And really tying these non-gate revenue sources more to wins, with performance on the field. I think that's definitely one of them. We had lots of discussions between the three of us about creative ways to really come up with performance-based revenue sharing of some of these things, which I think is something worth considering. And the other aspect of this, if you think about just from the player mobility and competition over players as a Theta type policy, increasing salaries more commensurate with production, things like draft spending constraints, that's something personally I feel had a big effect on this process, and shortening the time to arbitration for more players, or maybe increasing that bonus pool would be another way to sort of continue to move in the right direction, particularly if some of these incremental changes don't deliver the results that that both the players and the owners are hoping for. So with that, I think I'm just a little bit over my allotted time here. Let me say thank you again to SABR for the opportunity to present our work, and thanks Major League Baseball, Rawlings, all the sponsors. It's really been a great opportunity. This was a really fun project, and I'll open up the floor to questions. See what we got here. Okay, question from Eric. Great, thank you. In the recent CBA, do you think the owners were concerned with national and regional TV deals as the major sources of revenue and growth in the last decade drying up in the future, that then drove their reluctance to expand players' shares in revenue? That's a good question. I don't want to put words in the owners' mouths. I do think that clearly these TV deals, they are the big source, streaming deals, things of that nature. They are the big source of non-gate revenue. A lot has been done in that area, both at the team level and at the league level. I do think that maybe some of what was released by Forbes before the agreement took place, some of these new streaming deals might have actually prompted some of the progress that we saw. And I think that they made an attempt to work with the players on trying to share those kinds of revenues. How does the pre-arb pool, from Christian here, how does the pre-arb pool help incentivize the lower payroll teams? Doesn't that money come from a pool of money collected before the season and therefore not coming from the team's payroll? That's a good question. So we're not necessarily thinking about it in that way. So the way we're thinking about the pre-arb pool is actually just rewarding players more for the contribution that they're making to the team. So if all the teams are paying into that pool, it's a way of tying player salaries more to production. There are other ways to do that, and we heard several of them floated, I think, during the negotiations. I think at one point I'd even heard a discussion of linking salaries to wins above production to WAR values, things like that. I think anything in this framework, anything that sort of lessens that gap between what a player is contributing to wins and what he's getting paid is something that promotes competitive balance, because it forces the team to pay closer to the player's true value. How are jersey ads tied to wins? No, that's a good point. This is from Ben. This would be an indirect connection, which I think is why it's creative and interesting, but it's not going fully to what we're saying here. Player ads would be tying non-gate revenue to player performance more. If you think, I want to sponsor this player because I view him as being an important cog to the team. You'd have to sort of take it another level and be able to differentiate, the players that are really contributing to team wins and tying their performance to non-gate revenues. But it is creative. From Christian, would you recommend a salary floor? In my opinion, baseball already has a soft salary floor, much like there's a soft salary cap. The constraints on draft spending, the minimum salaries, while it doesn't equate directly up to a minimum salary floor for at the team level, I think it kind of has largely the same effects. Let's see here. Ryan Cartwright. Is the disparity between teams and non-gate revenue mostly local TV deals where the big franchises can demand a bigger contract? What else contributes? We do believe that a lot of that is coming from the TV deals, local TV deals, for sure. But a lot of the national revenues and the sale of MLB advanced media, those are shared among teams, so that there is an element of these non-gate revenues that are part of revenue sharing. So it's kind of has to be outside of what's being shared that's driving those differences. Jeffrey Brover, what are your thoughts on implementing a real salary cap and or salary floor in terms of competitive balance? From my perspective, I think the competitive balance tax and some of the restrictions at the bottom levels already act as a salary cap and a salary floor in a soft sense. In economics, there's this distinction between prohibiting an activity or taxing an activity. They largely can produce the same results if you set the taxes high enough. And so I don't view them as being a big distinction. The biggest distinction is from a tax, you can collect revenue and you can redistribute it. Whereas from a prohibition, you can't necessarily do that. So in that sense, the way baseball does things, you could view that as being maybe a more efficient way than what some of the other sports leagues do, if they do in fact redistribute those revenues in a way that promotes competitive balance. Noreen, thank you for the presentation. You're welcome. Thank you. Can you expand on the non-gate revenues more time to wins idea? How would they be tied to wins? Yeah, no, that's a good question. Very good question. I'm not, we talked a little bit about having some sort of like, backward looking tournament of nature. Is sort of like you put the non-gate revenues in a pool and you hold on to them and you don't distribute them until 3 years later, and you distribute them based on how teams performed over that period. So they'd have to sort of compete for them. Something like that would be a direct way to tie it. I'm not even sure if that's possible under collective bargaining rules, but that being creative like that, something like that is sort of what we had in mind. Could you put your email address in the chat box? Yes, I'd be happy to. You can either reach me at sabrave@hotmail.com. That's my personal address, or you can reach me at sbrave@morningconsult.com. That's my work email as well. And I'm sure SABR folks would be happy to share that with you also. Alex Stace, shouldn't the minimum salary be much higher, like 1.5 million? That rewards remain so lopsided, but this would have been a simple fix. I can see that argument, and that's one of the reasons why we describe what was done as being incremental. I don't think this will be the last time that you see minimum salaries move higher. I think these are small changes, but it's fair to say let's see what they do before we consider bigger ones. And honestly, that's something that's going to have to be collectively bargained. From Stephen, can you in a phrase or two explain luxury tax? Yeah, so the luxury tax or the competitive balance tax, that's essentially what's acting as your soft salary cap in baseball. That when your payroll overall levels are above a certain cutoff, you're subject to penalties. And this is sort of like the classic example in economics. If you tax something, you'll get less of it, and these things act as a tax. And the more onerous the tax is, the less your growth you're going to get. And I think it's quite clear if you look at the data, those competitive balance taxes had an effect over the last decade, certainly on those bigger market teams, which tend to drive a lot of that free agent spending. We didn't see that as much. So, but at the same time, those revenues were redistributed, and you did see some expansion in payrolls for smaller and middle market teams. So there are plus and minuses to these things, and all these things have to be collectively bargained. But like I said, I do think the most recent agreement was a step in the right direction for everyone, including the fans, which I count myself among. So I think that is all the questions. So I'll hand it back over. Oh, one last one. How will the changes in international signing rules impact non-gate revenue or be impacted? Wow, there's more coming in here. Now that's a good question. I know that's still being negotiated. So I think I'll hold off on responding to that because I'm also out of time. But if you guys email me, I'm happy to answer additional questions. So I'll hand it back to you, Scott.
Scott, thank you so much. As you noted, this is not a topic that's going to go anywhere. So looking forward to future research on this.